Good morning, everybody. It is a very chilly morning on the Brooklyn side of New York. As you can see, I'm wearing my full winter Icelandic gear here, and I think it is something around 22 degrees Fahrenheit. We're lucky we're sheltered from the wind, and today I actually want to talk about using something called a GigaPan. The name comes from the idea that a gigapixel would be 1,000 megapixels. So I don't know if all of your panoramic images from this are going to be 1,000 megapixels, but that's it. We're used to thinking of 24, 50, maybe 100 megapixels, but not 1,000. So the idea of creating an image that is 1,000 megapixels is insane, but that's technically 1 gigapixel. So as you can see, this is definitely larger than that small pano gimbal head that I've been using all over Dubai. And there are a couple different reasons I'm using this. One, this is a way that you can fully automate the panoramic sequence. The second reason is since I'm automating the panoramic sequence, it gives me the ability to shoot a GigaPan. The idea behind a GigaPan is basically to get the highest resolution panoramic image possible, and you do that by using a telephoto lens. So this thing is set up with my Nikon D810 and a 70-200 set to 70 millimeter. And once I configure the options for this, it will go through and shoot the sequence one tile at a time. Now 70 millimeters for a GigaPan is not that crazy. Most people who do this do it somewhere between 200 to 300 millimeters, means you can zoom right in on those details and you might have 100 or 200 tiles that you then stitch together. So you can imagine if we were doing 6 tiles or 8 tiles in vertical mode in Dubai and it's creating a 60 to 80 megapixel image, if we're doing 200 tiles at 200 millimeter, I don't even know what the size of the image would be. It's huge. So it allows you to maybe create a GigaPan out of it, something you can zoom in on the internet, something you can mess with and really see that infinite detail. Or it allows you to take an image like this of the Manhattan skyline and the Brooklyn Bridge and print it extremely large. So you might have a client that wants something printed on the side of a building or an entire billboard, something that people are going to walk right up to and look at. This will give you that amount of resolution. What I want to say about the GigaPan in general, though, is you do not need this to create this level of panorama. You can do it with a small gimbal, you can do it with a large fluid head gimbal, but what you're going to be doing if you're shooting 200 tiles, for example, is you're going to be creating that 100% manually, meaning you're going to have to turn the camera, shoot, turn the camera, shoot. Whereas this, once you program it in, it has complete camera control, so it's going to run through, shoot every frame for you, and you can even repeat it over and over and over again. So imagine this. Imagine you're shooting through the blue hour, the sunrise, and you're waiting for that light. You can actually program the panoramic image in, let it fire off 200 images or however many you have it set to, and then wait for the light to change, reset it, and get the exact same result over time. So each panoramic image that you stitch should theoretically be exactly the same each time. So it allows you to have a level of precision and control because it's a robotic moving fluid pano head. Now that I've talked about the GigaPan itself and what it's capable of, let's run through the setup together. This is attached directly to my tripod. There is no ball head here. This screws onto the tripod just like a ball head would. And then what I've done is I've leveled out the tripod and I've used this small little bubble level in the center of the GigaPan to make sure that that ball level is dead center of that circle, or at least to the best of my ability. This thing's kind of funny because the camera is actually above it and you want to make sure all the weight's on it before you level it. And it's kind of hard to see exactly if it's perfect. I kind of have to move my head around, but for the most part, it is very close. The one thing I could have added to my tripod, which to be fair and to be honest, I forgot in my storage unit, is a leveling base. So right now this is just a regular tripod. If you really want to get into this stuff, what I'd recommend is buying a leveling base. They make them for all tripods and all tripod manufacturers have them. It allows you to loosen a little extra element down here and add a little bit of rotation. You remember that little fluid pano head that I was using had a built-in leveling base? For tripods, you can add it as a feature here and it fits right on the apex. So what I'm having to do instead, rather than having that precision of control, is adjust the legs one at a time until I can get this to be level. And I'm actually doing this with the camera pretty much in the center. And the reason being is I know that right about here, if I kind of put my arm out here and out here, this is approximately the center of my panoramic image. Meaning that if I level it in the center, just like we did everywhere else, move it to the left and move it to the right, if it starts to drift off from the left to the right, at least I know that dead center, it's perfect. So if it's perfect in the center, you have a greater chance of it being perfect on the left extreme and the right extreme. So I think this is about as level as it's going to get. It's a pretty good shooting area. It's a concrete slab here. It's pretty level. There's no rocks. So this one was really easy to do with the tripod. If I was out in Iceland somewhere and I was standing on the side of a cliff, I'd need that leveling base to get this perfect. But right now it's pretty good. So the next thing that I want to do, this is a little bit different. I actually have the plate attached to the collar of the lens. And you notice that if I rotate this a little bit more towards the camera, you can see that the camera's pushed back a little bit further. Every time we want to do a panoramic image, even if we know that we don't have any parallax in the scene, which I've explained in previous lessons, we want to get as close to the nodal point as possible. On these longer lenses, that's actually further towards the front. So we have to be able to slide this back quite far to be able to compensate for it. So I want to just make sure that first that approximately that nodal point is set. Now remember, you can always calculate the nodal point on your camera so you know when you're shooting it's going to be perfect every time. Every system's going to be a little bit different. This one you actually have to slide it quite far back. And in addition to that, we're shooting this in landscape mode. This Pano gimbal's a little bit different. Where I usually orient everything into portrait mode or vertical, this one actually is programmed to work this way. So bear in mind that you can do panoramic images this way, but when we're doing a single row like we were doing in Dubai, I wanted to capitalize on having as much of the sky and as much of the foreground as possible. That's why I turned it into portrait mode, so when I overlapped, it would be a tall image that I was stitching together rather than a wide image that I was stitching together. But this is going to be multi-rows, so that's not going to come into play. But what is interesting is just like I've slid this back, I also have options to slide it down. So the idea here is once I loosen these up, if I can do it with my cold fingers, I can actually slide this down and make sure that the lens is not only centered in this pivot point, but it's also going to be centered on this pivot point. On the inside of this, there are measurements. And I assume if you're going to be working with something like this all the time at a telephoto lens, you'd probably be using the same millimeters each time. So once you have your camera and lens set up for this, you're not going to be changing it too often. You could probably leave this pretty much set up. So what I've done is I've slid this back so that it references the nodal point of the lens, and now I've slid it down so we have put these two axes of rotation right at the nodal point of the camera, and we're working at 70 millimeters. Before I go through the setup of this itself, what I'm going to need to do is balance the exposure. This is a multi-row panoramic image, so it's going to be interesting. We're actually going to be creating tiles. So we actually have columns and rows. So rows would be across and columns would be up and down. So before we just had one single row, but now we're going to have columns. This one's probably going to have 3 columns. It's going to have to shoot 3 columns that we're going to stitch together. And this one actually shoots in a strange order. It starts in the upper left, shoots down a column, and then goes back up and tiles all these things together. So before I was using aperture priority mode because it's very easy in Lightroom to put 8 tiles together and make minor adjustments in between. But the best thing you can do here, instead of shooting in aperture priority mode, is to lock everything down. The reason being is I may have one image that's just the sky, and I may have one image that's just the water. The sky and the water is going to meter completely different than the city itself. So what I'm going to do before I go into this and set it up is I'm going to figure out my camera settings. So the first thing I want to do, I'm going to put live view on. And I'm zoomed in quite far, so I also want to make sure that everything's locked down. Before I do the settings themselves, I'm actually just going to double check the focus. So I'm going to check the focus on the camera, and I'm going to make sure that everything is focused, everything looks perfect. I'm going to set that to manual mode. I want to make sure that my white balance is locked, so I'm just going to change the white balance to a custom setting. Again, in post you can change the white balance as much as you want, but I just want to make sure that it's consistent. Again, if it's shooting the sky and then it's shooting the city, it's probably going to select a slightly different white balance, and I just want to do it now even though I can change it in post. Next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to toggle this over to aperture priority mode, and I'm going to kind of move it around, and I'm just going to use these little arrow keys here to move it around, and it's giving me a reading somewhere between in the sky, f8 1/100, in the water, f8 1/50. So that's a complete stop of difference between the sky and the water. So I probably want to do is meter somewhere in the middle for the city. It's basically saying 1/80 for the city, 1/100 for the sky, and 1/50 for the water. So I think 1/80 or 1/80 is probably going to be right in the middle. And I'm going to test this before I shoot it, so I'm just going to take a quick shot. And as you can see, if you're going to test this, this is super wobbly, but it doesn't matter. I just want to check exposure. And actually, if I look at this, the live view, that looks pretty good. I may even be able to underexpose a little bit. So right now, it's set to 1/80. I'm going to toggle it to manual mode, and I'm going to set it to 1/100, and take another test shot. Check my histogram, and that actually looks perfect. So I'm going to leave these settings as is. I know that it's perfectly focused. f8 1/100. I have a custom Kelvin temperature set to be quite warm, so the sky's still a little bit blue, city's nice and gold. Now what I'm going to do is set up this panorama. So when I click the power button, it's going to ask me if I want to create a new panorama. I've gone through and said, yes, I want to create a new panorama. It says set your focal length on your lens, and I've gone ahead and done that as well. Then, once I hit OK, it's going to ask me to move the camera, position it to the upper left of the frame. So the first step I'm going to do is pick the upper left of my pano, and the next step is going to be the lower right. Before I set the top left and the lower right and build this panoramic image, something I should point out is I'm shooting at 70 millimeter, which is actually kind of wide for GigaPan stuff. And if you're shooting somewhere a little bit more zoomed in, maybe 135 to 200, you may need to go into the options here and designate the field of view of your lens. So online, I looked up what the field of view was for 70 millimeter. That was actually the default setting in this system itself. But if you zoom in and change the field of view, you're actually going to be able to determine the amount of overlap on the image. It actually uses the field of view to determine how much overlap you need. So check your lens, Google the field of view for the millimeter you intend to use, and make sure that it works and is set correctly in the system before you start. White balance is set, exposure is set, everything's set to manual, this thing's ready to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out the upper left of the image, and actually in order to do that, I have the bridge here on the right. I think the highest point of this whole panorama is going to be this bridge itself. So I'm actually going to go up here and figure out, okay, now I have the Brooklyn Bridge, I have the rope sort of coming out the top right of the frame. So what I'm going to do now that I have that set, I know that's the highest point, I'm going to rotate around here. And honestly, all I'm doing is pressing this button, waiting for it to rotate. I'm going to go past the skyline. Maybe I'll include the Statue of Liberty. Statue of Liberty is pretty important out here in New York City. Here's the upper left side. You can see that it's actually now, it's starting to be a little bit off level, but there's nothing I can do about that because it was set level in the beginning. I'm going to go ahead and mark this and say OK. Now it's going to say, all right, upper left set, move it to the lower right. So we'll move it back over, just like this. All the way over here, a little bit further. That looks good. And I'm going to move it down. And there's a pylon over here. Move it down into the water. That pylon, if I just draw a line across from that pylon, that's plenty of water. That's exactly what I want. So I'm going to go there as my lower right boundary. And right now I'm going to say OK. It's going to say now it's going to take 12 horizontal picks and 4 vertical picks. So it's going to be 4 by 12. So it's going to be 4 columns of 12. It's actually going to be a pretty big panoramic image. I'm going to say OK. Lower right corner set. Now it's going to ask me a couple questions. The first thing is show panorama. I'm going to skip that. If I say show, it's just going to run through it and I can watch the back of the live view, make sure everything's okay. But I know everything's going to be okay. So start anyway. You're going to take 48 photos. I'm going to start. And camera on, yes. And as I hit OK, it's just going to remind me of a few things. Is the balance locked? Yeah, white balance is locked. Is exposure locked? Yes, exposure is locked. Focus locked? Yes, focus is locked. Flash off? That's actually a good one. I'm glad that it tells you to take the flash off. We'll say okay, and it's going to say taking panorama. And now, all I have to do is wait for this thing to go. And you can see it's going to go to the upper left. It has camera controls, so it's going to take one shot. It's going to move down, it's going to take the shots. I'm only doing one shot because this is a very early morning golden hour panorama, so I don't need to do any type of exposure blending on this. And with panoramic work we've already done, we had maybe somewhere between 5 and 7 tiles. If you want to do exposure blending or need to do exposure blending with 5 or 7 tiles, that's very doable. But something like 48, I want to make sure I can lock it in with one exposure, and in this case I underexpose just a hair like I usually do with the X-T2 or the Nikon D810, because I know if I need to pull those shadows up, it's not going to be that hard to do in Lightroom. I really want to avoid any kind of complex exposure blending unless I need to. So if I was shooting right into the sun, then we might have to do something a little bit more complicated, but thankfully this scene is beautifully lit, nice golden light on it, and I think everything's going to come together perfectly with one exposure. This panorama is going to take about, it said 4 minutes and 50 seconds, but it seems like it's going to wrap up quicker than that. I think it accounts for the exposure time or adds more time in it, but that's something to point out. When we were shooting the blue hour in Dubai, it's like a blue 5 minutes, so I had to quickly build that panorama, and I was shooting at ISO 200 at f8, so I had relatively short exposures, maybe 10 to 15 seconds. But if you can imagine trying to do a GigaPan during blue hour when you only have 5 minutes and you're shooting 30-second exposures, by the time you finish these 48 or 68 or however many tiles you have, blue hour is going to be over. So what you need to do in that situation is you may have to sacrifice a few things. Rather than shooting at f8, at ISO 100, you might have to shoot something like f4 at ISO 400, because you're going to have to calculate the blue hour or the blue time of the morning that you want to shoot is only going to be 5 minutes long. Then you literally only have 5 minutes to shoot every single one of these tiles. And because you're doing this with so many tiles, and because this is an automated process, it may take a little bit longer than doing it manually. If I wanted to do it quickly, I could probably do it manually quicker than this robotic arm is moving very slow. It's moving up. I probably just could have been up there and shooting it much faster. The other thing, if I was shooting this, I would not go up, down, I'd actually start in the center and I'd move across, move up, move across, move down, move across, because it's much quicker of a motion. This thing actually has to go up, down, over, and then all the way back up before it takes a shot. So while it does have a lot of advantages, main advantage being I don't actually have to do it manually, it does have some limitations, so it's going to take a little bit longer to put this together. So bear that in mind, and when you're working with this thing, and to be honest, I don't have a lot of experience working with these, I like to do everything manually because you guys know I travel for a living. This thing weighs more than my cameras and lenses combined, so I prefer a little pocket pano rig. But this will give you the opportunity to get some really cool stuff, but you want to practice first. Having an evenly lit skyline like this is the perfect trial, because even as the sun goes up, my exposure is going to change a little bit, but not by much, and I don't have a dynamic lighting environment where I have to worry about it. All that being said, I think this is going to look pretty good when it's all done, and I hope it's going to stitch together. I can only assume that with this much setup, everything being level and exposed correctly, in post, it's not going to be a question of whether it stitches together, it's going to be a question of whether my computer explodes when I try to give it 48 36 megapixel images to stitch together. So it's going to be really interesting when we get into post-processing how this looks when it gets put together and how long it takes. I'm also anticipating right now that at this level of detail there could be a lot of issues. When I'm zoomed out, if I did this at, I don't know, 18 millimeter and I just did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tiles, I'm not zoomed way into this infinite detail. I have all these little crisscrossing lines on the bridge, I have converging lines here, I have cars in the infinite distance, and since I'm at 70 millimeter at 36 megapixels, I'm going to see all of those little converging lines, I'm going to see all of those cars moving, anything that's in the water, all of these little things We have 48 tiles that we're putting together. I can guarantee that when I zoom in Photoshop after all this is stitched together, there are going to be a lot of little inconsistencies, a lot of little problems, and a lot of cleanup to happen. So that's something else. Even though this is going to be extremely high res, super high detailed, you can print it as large as you can imagine, literally as large as you're willing to put one of these things together and render it out. It's still going to cause you a lot of headache inside of Photoshop because there's going to be a lot of little discrepancies that you have to clean up from tile to tile, and you're dealing with insane processing power and time. So bear that in mind. While it may seem like an awesome thing to have this super high-res image, you're also going to create a lot of work for yourself. And that also goes into the fact that if you are shooting into a crazy lighting environment and you're going to have to do exposure blending, you're multiplying that by the amount of frames that you shoot. So you may spend sometimes, I don't know, I could see myself spending a day, 2 days on one panoramic image, where if I would have just zoomed out a little bit and settled for something that was 60 to 100 megapixels in total, I may be working for a couple hours instead of a couple days. So it's just something to keep in mind. But I still think that this has some potential, and if you get hired to do something like this for a living, I think if I had to do these every day or a few times a week, it would be nice to have this. If I lived here in New York and I was shooting high-resolution panos all the time, this might be a great investment because I can just program everything in, and on a day like this, I can just let it run and I can go hide where it's somewhere warmer than over here in the wind on the Brooklyn side. So that wraps it up for the GigaPan Epic Pro V and our super high resolution pano of the Manhattan skyline and the Brooklyn Bridge. So the next step is to get all of these images into post-processing. We're going to look at different ways to stitch this together. We're going to find out if it stitches together correctly, and then we're going to find all the problems together that occur from shooting a multi-row telephoto panoramic image. The next time I see you guys, it's going to be much warmer in the studio and in post-processing. What's up, everybody? It's time to take a look at the results of shooting the New York skyline with the GigaPan. Now, I have to admit, I was a skeptic of the GigaPan at first. I wasn't sure if everything was going to line up, but as you're going to see, it actually came out better than expected. Let's jump into Lightroom and take a look at the shots themselves. Now, when I was in New York, I did a couple different versions. I tried to capture the golden hour, and you can see that intense golden light here. Now you're going to see 53 photos. That's because I've already stitched the panorama, and I'll explain why shortly. But essentially what we have here, from the first all the way to the last, you can see the order that it was shooting, up to down, left to right. We actually have 52 images at 70 millimeters, so that's quite a few. Up until now, we've been shooting everything in portrait mode, rotating it and having a single row panorama. So this is actually 4 rows and 52 individual images. So it's quite massive in scale. Not only that, it was shot with a Nikon D810, so each panel itself is 36 megapixels. Before we actually stitch this, let's make some adjustments. First thing is this is a little overexposed, but I also want to point out something else that's pretty important. If we look at this, notice how that says 8100820.jpg. Yes, that's right. This is 52 JPEGs. I tried to process this in Lightroom using the RAWs, and I got the spinny beach ball of death multiple times. I tried this for about half a day, and even with the JPEGs, these are full resolution JPEGs, 36 megapixel, they're huge files. Even with the JPEGs, my computer, my MacBook Pro actually struggles to put these together. But I do want to point something out. Before I exported the JPEGs, I actually did remove chromatic aberrations and enable profile corrections. The reason being is this was a Tamron lens, so I had to custom select both Tamron and the lens. So it was Tamron 70 to 200. I selected that, and then I exported out these JPEGs. So these JPEGs are not quite raw files, but they are kind of powerful. So let's just make some adjustments here. And the only thing is this was a unified exposure. So remember, I set everything manually in the field. So I'm just going to set this down to negative 75. Now when I build the panorama, it's going to apply that. It's going to take all these JPEGs now, and it's still going to create a DNG file. So it's not creating that DNG file out of the raw files like it was before, but it's doing it with the JPEG. So obviously when you're doing this kind of work and it's going to blow up to, oh man, mountain size. These files are huge. We're obviously going to want to use TIFFs or raw files and not JPEG. But for the sake of actually getting my computer to handle these things, for demonstration purposes, today we're going to be using the JPEG files. So if I do make that change to the highlights, I can copy it here. Don't need any of those, and just the basic tone. And I can go ahead and select them all. And paste settings. First thing I want to show you is that if we go up to Photo, Photo Merge, Panorama, Lightroom will actually stitch all these together. Lightroom's actually built the preview. No doubt in editing, they've sped through that progress bar a little bit. That was about 5 minutes of waiting just to get to this point. And I actually have auto crop enabled. Something to point out here, this horizon's already perfect. If I use the boundary warp, it actually kind of rotates things a little bit. See how it's rotating things? So I don't want to use the boundary warp in this case. I'm just going to leave it the way it is and select auto crop because I'd crop out those pixels anyway. Now, the next step would be to hit the merge button. But when I tested this out, if I click that merge button, it will take a little bit longer than an hour to process this panoramic image. Now when I tried it with RAW, it crashed. I waited about an hour and Lightroom just completely crashed. But with these JPEGs, it takes about an hour and 10 minutes. So I'm going to cancel this, and we're just going to take a look at the result itself. All right, so here is the final result with the auto cropping, and you can see, yep, it did apply the negative 75%. Well, how big is this image? This is, again, 52 36 megapixel files. How big is it? Let's go to the library, scroll down here to the bottom. You can see that it is actually cropped. It is 45,500 by 10,100. So what I did is I did a Google search for megapixel calculator so I could figure out how many megapixels this is. So this is 45,522 by 10167. Let's calculate those megapixels. Wow, so that is 462,822 174 pixels, which means that it is 463 megapixels, almost a half a gigapixel. So it's not even a full gigapixel, and it's already making the computer struggle. You imagine if I would have shot this at 200 millimeter, I'm not sure if I would have been able to even process it. Let's go back into Lightroom and we'll take a look. Now once this is all put together, you can obviously make the same adjustments that you could any other DNG. And if I zoom in here, you can see all those details. We're seeing planes and helicopters. If I go over here, we actually can see these boats. We can see the Statue of Liberty. Since this is shot at 70 millimeter, we have an intense amount of detail. And look at the background here. Look at all the detail in the background. We can actually find areas where people are walking, things are going on. It was a cold morning, not a lot of people out. And even here, if we look at the bridge, all of these wires, look how well the stitching did. Look how well it was applied. Came out really, really good. I expected there to be more problems. Now, obviously, there's going to be things in the sky that you want to clean up and different things. You know, obviously, the sky was blue, but it's still a really beautiful shot. But the thing is, Lightroom's kind of tricky, because you don't know what's going to happen once you click the merge button. In fact, it wasn't until I exported JPEGs that I was able to actually get the result. So far in Photographing the World, we've done everything just using Lightroom and Photoshop. And I wanted to first show you that you can do this in Lightroom and Photoshop. You don't need to exit to a different plugin. But if you want to, my recommendation would be GigaPano Giga. And currently, at the recording of this tutorial, that's at version 4.4. When you open GigaPano Giga, it looks pretty empty. You have a side here on the left and another side on the right. You can see that you can actually move that bar a little bit. What I'm actually going to do, what I've set up here inside of this New York folder, I have every single one of these full-size JPEGs. And if you want to build a panorama, you can actually load JPEGs, TIFFs, PSDs, even RAW files into AutoPano Giga, but I'm going to go ahead and use the JPEGs. You can either search the folder by clicking here, search multiple images by clicking here, or you can do what I like to do and drag and drop the folder right to the application. Once you do, you're going to get every single tile, every single image here as a thumbnail, and it'll automatically detect. It's going to tell you what it is, 52, 70mm, 1/40, f8, gives you the date that we shot it, 4 minutes, and if I press play on detection, it's going to run through and create a preview. Now, I can guarantee that this is going to be much faster than Adobe Lightroom. It's actually going to run through this and generate a low-resolution preview, which is actually nice. Gives us the preview before it renders. Once it renders, it throws it over here on the right, so you have this group associated with this. You see group 0, 1 panorama, group 0, 52 image.pano. .pano is a AutoPano Giga file, so you can actually save this file, make changes to the pano. Now that's pretty cool because if we click Edit, it brings this up in the graph. Now there are a lot of advanced controls here if you were loading RAW files in, and it gives you the ability to see some different elements. Something that Photoshop and Lightroom don't have is the ability to actually go in and see how these things are stitched. For example, clicking up here on the image editor, we can actually go in and see how each one of these images is being applied and how it's being distorted. So we can actually see, because we used that GigaPan tool, you can see how evenly these things are distributed. They're almost like a perfect grid pattern. And they better be, because that was a robotic head that we had on top of our tripod. So that's pretty nice. So it shows you the quality, the average overlapping, and everything. So this one's pretty much perfect. I'll toggle this off. This pano is pretty much perfect, but see this center line? This basically gives you the center of the panorama, or the center of the distortion point of the panorama, and you can see everything looks pretty good. If I had sort of an off horizon, if it was bent a little bit, or if I shot this handheld, I could actually go in and adjust it with this tool here. I could move this point, and you can see if I move that point, it's actually going to bend it around that vertice. Now obviously this one's actually perfect, but if it was a little bit bent, or bent down or bent up or off a little bit, all I would have to do is adjust this point, and you can see it would make adjustments to the way that this bends on the panoramic image. But since we used the GigaPan, this one came out perfect. I'm going to close this. The nice thing about AutoPano Giga is also the batch features. Let's bring in a couple other panos. Let's bring in the two that we've done before, Shangri-La and Vision Tower. I'm just going to drag these in. When I drag these in, you can see it brings everything in, reads the EXIF data, gets everything ready to go, and if you see, if I press detect, I can actually detect multiple panos at once. Both of them will render, and I'll end up with the full preview. So here, for example, I can go in and make edits to this. So we know the horizon's perfect, but we can also go in and make adjustments. So these are JPEGs, but if we use the raw images, we could actually make adjustments to the color correction itself. And you can see that I can actually change the exposure compensation here in the application. Now I'm not sure if it does a great job with raw files. I'm sure it does a good job with raw files, but I tend to trust Lightroom a little bit more. So good workflow. If you want to use this, if you want to use the AutoPano Giga system, you can export from Lightroom as TIFF and then load them into here. Another thing that's really interesting, if I select the layers here, you can see that my overlap is a little heavy. See next to the Burj Khalifa, see 1 and 7 here? I can probably take this and right-click and remove picture. And you can see that I can still get the panoramic result. So in this case, this panorama stitches perfectly, but you can see I had extra overlap when I was in Dubai just in case. So using this will give you a good idea if you actually need to shoot as many. And I can probably get away with deleting a few of these, or every other one, for example, just like this. So we'll go ahead and delete 6. And you know what? I think we need this one because it's on the right. But if I look at it, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 images instead. So you can actually delete them. Now this comes in handy if you have a problem. Sometimes you could have a weird overlap. Let's say part of the overpass sort of overlapped a little bit and actually didn't stitch properly. What I could do is delete one of those images and hopefully it would make up by extrapolating the details from these two images rather than the one in between. So this is a really powerful piece of software. The one final thing that I want to show you, the nice thing about this is that you can also batch. So after you're done, I just want to point something out. Now this is pretty small. I know it's 15,000 pixels I'm calling small, but compared to almost 50,000, this one is quite small. This pano is huge. But what I can actually do is go in and render this however I want. The nice thing is I can render a small version or I can render the full size. And you can see at the size right now at 72 dpi, it's actually reading at 563 megapixels, which is really interesting. What I want to point out here, which is really important, when I render this large New York City image out, I can designate from here, I can designate it to be a PSD or PSB file. Now we haven't really worked with PSB before, but essentially PSD files are compressed. And that compression algorithm means that those files cannot exceed 2 gigabytes in size. Well, I can guarantee when I export this pano, it's going to be larger than 2 gigs. What AutoPano will do is it will calculate if that becomes larger than 2 gigabytes, it will make a PSB file, which can be anything from 2 to 200 or even more. It can be larger than that. It can be as large as you want it to be. It doesn't have the restrictions. So that's a really nice feature, so you can actually export directly. And then of course you can change your resolution to 300 dpi or whatever else you're working on. Give it a file name and you can actually save it to any folder and you can click render. The nice thing is you can also queue these up. If I were to save these, so I just say do save as here, and if I save them on the desktop, each one of these, we'll call this NYC, and I'll save. If I call this one on the desktop, we'll call this Shangri-La, and we'll call this one Vision Tower. And what I can actually do inside of these settings, you can see here we have, let's say, 300 dpi, PSB, PSD, and we'll give this a file name too. So at the end, this will be NYC. I'll say apply. Same thing here. We'll change this one to 300 dpi. And I'll say that's going to be a PSB file as well. And you can see that it's going to pick up the name that I already named the file, so we'll say apply. Same thing here, change this to 300 dpi, and again a PSB, and we'll apply. The nice thing is, if I go over here, this is a render queue. If I click this, I can actually add those 3 panos to it, open it, and then I can batch render by hitting play. Again, this is going to take some time. I guarantee it won't take as much time as Lightroom took, but it's still going to take some time. So this is really nice. It gives you the ability to preview these panos even if they're gigapixels. They could be 2 gigapixels. You can get this to preview low resolution. You can make all your adjustments, any kind of tweaks or modifications that you need. Make sure everything's going to stitch perfectly. Then you can throw it in the batch render, set this, go have a cup of coffee, or let it sit overnight, and hopefully you should end up with the final stitched result. Now I am not going to render this in the background. Instead, I'm going to go right back into Lightroom. If you go the Lightroom route, a good rule of thumb here is to definitely do your editing inside of Lightroom first. For example, here, if I feel the shadows are a little bit too rough on the water, I can actually just bring them up just like this. If I want to add overall contrast, I can do it here. If I want to adjust the exposure a little bit or the highlights, I can do that here as well. You can see that I can pull all that down, pull the shadows up, and make the tweaks. Now here's the reason why. Once I export this into Photoshop, and I'm going to go ahead and export it here, not with previous, because I have to point out something else. Lightroom does not accept PSB files. Even though they're an Adobe file container, it's going to export a PSD. If this file, as a DNG, I can tell you it's already over 2 gigabytes. If it's over 2 gigabytes, it will not allow you to export it, so you have to do something different. You have to export it as a TIFF. You definitely don't want to use a JPEG. We can just export it as a TIFF. And if you want 16-bit, same exact settings that we usually use, Pro Photo RGB, and say open in Photoshop. And once I do that, it's going to open up this file. And just like that, our pano is going to appear inside of Photoshop, and if I zoom in, all of that detail is there, and I can kind of pan around and take a look maybe spy on some people across there. You can actually almost read all those signs. That's pretty good. We can see a lot of detail back there. Now, let's zoom out a little bit. I think this pano is really nice. Now, obviously, could it use a dramatic sky? Yes, it could. Would I composite a sky into an image this large? Probably not. Let's go to the image size and find out why. Well, right now, 45,000 pixels is actually 151 inches. That's a tremendous amount of space to fill. So I'd have to have one massive panoramic sky equal in the size to do this. The best thing I could possibly do is reshoot this and rerun the panorama itself. And here's the reason. This file is already, you can see down here on the bottom of the screen, 2.59 gigs. Well, let's say I start editing this. We'll start with the easy stuff. If we were going to edit this together, we'd get rid of the seagull here, these little birds. We might even want to get rid of the little wispy clouds. And of course, there's some helicopters, there's some planes, there are some other things. If we go down here, you can also see there's a little bit of, I don't even know what that is. We'll call it scum here in the water. So the water's a little bit scummy. And then down here on the right, there's some more here. All of these things are pretty easy to remove. Another seagull, really easy to remove. But check this out. When I start doing these edits, let's say I duplicate this. Let's say we want to go into the Adobe Camera Raw filter. So I just need to duplicate this first. That 2.59 transforms into 517. Basically, anytime I add a new layer of itself, or duplicate this, it's going to double the file size. So this file size right now is past 5 gigs. So you have to be really sparing with your adjustments, but you have to also work at PSB. So when you do a save as, we want to save it here as large document format. And you can see up here, it's pano.psb. So that's going to save it as the large document format. Now obviously the save times and load times are going to be a little bit longer, and it's going to tax Photoshop a little bit more. So you want to keep that in mind when you're making the adjustments. Something else that I want to point out here, when you start working with pixels at this size, everything you do starts to add up. For example, if I duplicate this, go up to Filter, High Pass, even though this is a high pass filter, I'll just pick 3. You can see how long it's taking just to do one high-pass filter. If I set this to overlay, once it pops up, good, it did. You can see that it's still making it larger. So now it still is somewhere between 2.9 and 517 gigs. So we have to be really careful. And I want to point that out because that's important, because we've created some other things here. So even if I get that back to 2.59, if I go into my actions and we create our luminosity masks. Let's create our luminosity masks. With the highlights, shadows, and midtones created, you can see that it still created a larger file. So literally everything that you do, every little tweak, every little adjustment is going to stack up and add up. And when I'm putting something like this together, any time that I've worked at a megapixel count this high, my PSB files in the end up being about 25 gigs. So you have to keep that in mind. So do everything sparingly. This is also a really good example of when you want to try to get everything right in the field. The larger the image, the more panels you're going to shoot, the more complicated the pano. That's when you really want to focus on getting everything right in camera and in the field, and potentially using something like the GigaPan system. Now, I don't shoot panos like this all the time, but if I did, I think the GigaPan would be a very viable option. Now, after understanding how massive this file actually is, I just want to point out a few things that you guys can do. Obviously, the biggest thing that I do on this image is just the object removal, and what I'd also probably do is get rid of these little jet trails on the sky. I'd basically take advantage of the sky being pristine and blue. I just go through and find anything distracting, but other than that, this image I think is very, very beautiful. This is usually the point in the lesson where I bring in the original raw file and we take a look at the incredible transformation of before and after. But that's not the case with this image, because this image was actually 52 36 megapixel panels that resulted in one massive image. So this lesson is a little bit different because I'm not going to be getting into the post-processing because, to be honest, aside from a little bit of object removal, this image is pretty much done. What I wanted to show you guys was how to create the largest images possible. In Dubai, we did everything manual with a little gimbal and the X-T2, but here in New York, we used a dedicated piece of hardware, the GigaPano system, and the D810 at 70 millimeter. And that wraps up this lesson. The New York, we'll call it half a gigapixel. And it also wraps things up here for Photographing the World 3 in the post-processing studio. I hope you guys enjoyed all the lessons, and I hope you also now have a strong understanding of how to create everything manually just using Lightroom and Photoshop. It's been an incredible year and an incredible journey around the world producing Photographing the World 3. From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank each and every one of you for purchasing and watching this tutorial. We could not continue to produce content like this without your continued support. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to definitely check out the Facebook group. It's an excellent community of very talented photographers, and we're all there trying to help each other and even organize local meetups. Also, feel free to reach out to me on social media anytime, whether you guys use Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. I'm very active on every single piece of social media, and I would love to get together sometime in your city for a cup of coffee. About to actually pack things up here and fly out west to Monument Valley. And just between us, who knows, maybe we'll see some of those locations in the next Photographing the World.